Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening and welcome to the World Affairs Council. Our speaker this evening is David Ignatius, Associate Editor of and columnist for the Washington Post. I am Heidi Shoup, President of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., and it is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening and to introduce our guest, David Ignatius. Readers of the Washington Post know him as a journalist, an award-winning columnist for his foreign affairs commentary. Movie fans and readers of spy thrillers may know him as well or better as the author of The Increment, Body of Lies, The Sun King, A Firing Offense, Bank of Fear, Agents of Innocence, and others. Body of Lies was made into a 2008 film by Ridley Scott, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Russell Crowe. His eighth novel is Blood Money, a novel about espionage set in modern-day Pakistan. We have copies here for sale, and the author will sign your books at the conclusion of the program tonight. In one of those cases where truth may indeed be stranger, or at least as strange as fiction, he is with us today to talk about U.S.-Pakistan relations. In the wake of killing Osama bin Laden by U.S. Special Forces in a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and following the outing of a CIA agent there only months ago when the agent killed several Pakistanis he claimed were threatening him. And of course, the relationship between the United States and Pakistan has so many layers of interdependencies that it may be akin to Churchill's description of Soviet foreign policy, a puzzle inside a riddle wrapped in an enigma, and the key is nationalism, or perhaps in this case, lack of nationalism, or too much nationalism, or mixed nationalism. Mr. Ignatius is well positioned to talk with us about U.S.-Pakistan relations. In 1990, he became the Post's foreign editor, where he oversaw the Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of the Iraq invasion of Kuwait. He began writing his column in 1998 and continued even during a 3-year stint as executive editor of the International Herald Tribune in Paris. Earlier in his career, he was reporter for the Wall Street Journal, covering at various times the Justice Department, the CIA, the Senate, the Middle East, and the State Department. He grew up here in Washington and studied political theory at Harvard and economics at King's College, Cambridge. Please join me in welcoming David Ignatius.
Thank you to Heidi for that very nice introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming out on a miserably hot day. I know you were really literature lovers or Pakistan lovers to brave the heat, and it's nice to be here with you. I'm going to talk about U.S.-Pakistan relations, but I want to do so because I'm in sort of shameless merchandising mode in the context of my novel. And I'm going to start off, with your indulgence, reading a portion of the novel, a little bit from the beginning. Usually when I've read on the Diane Rehm show or at other events like this, I've read from an opening chapter which is set in South Waziristan, in which I imagine what it's like to be under a predator attack, in which I imagine the effect that would have on someone from South Waziristan, a place that I visited in my reporting and research, as I'll explain, as he sees his whole family in an instant wiped out. But I'm actually going to read the chapter that immediately follows that, the beginning of it, because I think it sets up what I have to say about the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, and more particularly the relationship between the CIA and the ISI. So this is datelined. As a journalist, I always have a dateline in my chapters, datelined Islamabad. In the softening light of another afternoon, that's after the afternoon that I described, that's so grim, in which there's a predator attack, nearly 2 years later, The facade of the Inter-Services Intelligence Headquarters looked almost welcoming. It was an anonymous gray stucco building in the Atbara neighborhood of the capital, set back from the Kashmir Highway. The only distinctive feature was a ribbon of black stone that wrapped around the front, making it look as tidy as a gift box. Although the building was unmarked, the ISI's presence in the neighborhood was hardly a secret. Pakistanis and other branches of the military referred to its operatives as the boys from Atbara, as if they were a neighborhood gang to whom special respect must be paid. Ordinary Pakistanis made it a rule not to speak about the ISI at all. Inside this house of secrets, facing onto an enclosed garden, was the office of the Director General, who in recent years had been a soft-spoken man named Mohammed Malik. On his shoulders he wore the crossed swords and crescent insignia of a lieutenant general. His authority didn't come from his rank in the army, but from his control of information. It was almost always the case that General Malik knew more than the people around him, but he made it a rule never to flaunt what he knew or to disclose how he had obtained it. That would be insecure and worse, impolite. General Malik was not an imposing man, at least in the way of a military officer. He was trim with a neat mustache, and he was careful about what he ate and drank, almost to the point of fastidiousness. He had soft hands and a reticent manner. It was easy to forget that he was in fact a professional liar who told the entire truth only to his commander, the Chief of Army Staff. On this particular spring afternoon, General Malik had a concern he wasn't sure how to address. The brigadier who represented his service in Karachi had called to alert him to a potential problem. Now, there were large and small problems in Pakistan, but the very biggest ones were often connected to the words United States of America. For it was said, not without reason, that Pakistan's life was bounded by the three A's, Allah, Army, and America, and in the brigadier's news from Karachi, all three were tied up in one. It was part of General Malik's aura among his colleagues at General Headquarters in Rawalpindi that he knew how to handle the Americans. This was based partly on the fact that he'd spent a year at the Army War College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And if you knew Kansas, people said, well, then you knew the real America. Malik had actually disliked Kansas, and the only part of America he had truly loved was the Rockies, where the thin air and the steep peaks reminded him of his ancestral home in the mountains of Kashmir. But he knew how to sham in the way that is an art form for the peoples of South Asia, and so he had pretended for years to have a special fondness for Americans from the heartland. In that spirit of sincere and also false bonhomie, the Director General placed a call to Homer Barkan, the chief of the CIA station at the ever-expanding American Embassy in Islamabad. Their regular liaison meeting was scheduled for later in the week, but General Malik asked if his American partner might stop by that afternoon, perhaps right away if it was convenient. He didn't explain why, for he had found that it is always a good rule to say less than you mean, especially when you were dealing with the Americans who do the opposite. My friend Homer, said General Malik in greeting the chief of station when he arrived in Atbara 45 minutes later. He usually addressed him that way, and the American responded by calling him my friend Mohammed, or sometimes when he wanted something, just my friend Mo. General Malik found that especially grating, but he never said anything. He clasped his visitor's hand in the firm way that Americans like. Barkan did not look well. His face was doughy, and he looked bulky in his suit jacket, like a sausage ready to burst its casing. General Malik knew why. Homer Barkan had been drinking, and the reason was that he had legal problems back home. He was one of the many CIA officers who'd been caught in the boomerang of the War on Terror. It was said that he had crossed the line in a previous job by being overzealous in targeting the enemy. Looking at Homer Barkan, his eyes dark from the sleeplessness of depression, his collar button straining against the flesh of his neck, it seemed unlikely that he had ever been capable of zealotry in any form. But this was the after picture. He would not have been made station chief in Islamabad if there had not been a before. My dear friend Homer, the Pakistani continued, I hope you will not mind me saying so, but you are looking a little tired. You must be working too hard. You don't know the half of it, believe me, said the CIA officer. No, indeed, I do not, or even the quarter of it, and I'm sorry for it, whatever it may be. But I hope you will take care of yourself in these treacherous times. You are a guest in our house. You are precious to us. Appreciate it. Barkin's eyes were flat and his demeanor was impassive. He was not a man who was easily flattered or cajoled. What's up, General? Let me put it to you, sir. We've had many successes together in recent years, have we not? You could almost say that we're partners. Am I right? And so we like to think there's a bit of trust between us, even though we are a poor and weak country compared to the United States. We have our pride, you see. I never forget that, Mohammed, not for one day. Well then, I have a question for you. Normally, I would not trouble you late in the afternoon with such a detail, but this one is rather important. I hope you will forgive the imposition and apologize to Mrs. Barkin for delaying your return home this evening. Mrs. Barkin lives in Washington, General. I don't know if I can give you an answer, but I won't tell you a lie. General Malek smiled. Americans did not like lying to others. It made them uncomfortable. Their specialty was lying to themselves. Well now, sir, here it is. Are you running operations in Pakistan outside of your normal organization? Forgive me for being so blunt, but that is what I must ask. Barkin cocked his head as if he had ear trouble and wanted to make sure he'd heard it right. He might be old, but he wasn't stupid. Sorry, I didn't quite hear that, General. What do you mean? The Pakistani sat back in his chair. He put his hands together and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he spoke louder this time. Let me state the question as clearly as I can, sir. Is the United States sending intelligence officers into Pakistan outside the normal CIA cover channels? Is your agency doing it, or is some other agency doing it? That is what I want to know. Are you running a new game against us? You see, we think that we know you well, but we hear rumblings of something that we do not know. And let us be honest, no one likes to be surprised. Barkin's mouth puckered as if he'd just eaten something bad. Shit, Mohammed. You know I can't answer a question like that. We'll see if the bleep machine on the cameras works. So I wanted to read that because it sets up the basic tension of this novel and the basic tension of the relationship between the United States and Pakistan. We've just lived through an amazing 6 months in which the United States was caught doing exactly what is described in this opening passage of the book, running essentially undeclared operations, in this case in Lahore, in this case involving Raymond Davis, a contract officer who was part of a larger effort. The Pakistanis clearly were winning. I've quoted an unnamed Pakistani official who was interviewed by the Associated Press as saying that the people who were following, the Pakistanis who were following Raymond Davis were known to him. And as you know, Raymond Davis shot and killed the two Pakistanis who were tailing him. He was arrested and put in jail. And a classic moment of tension in this relationship between the United States and Pakistan, the CIA and the ISI, enveloped them both. What was haunting for me as the author of a novel who had months ago written the passage that I just read to you, and many months before that had decided to call it Blood Money, was that the way that was chosen to escape this confrontation, and I should underline the way that was chosen at the urging of Pakistanis, was the traditional tribal ritual that we call blood money, the payment of a substantial sum, in this case roughly $2.3 million, to the families of the two Pakistani victims. And speedily, with the payment of the blood money, Pakistani courts which respect this traditional tribal way of discharging an obligation, in effect, officially pardoned Raymond Davis for the crime of killing the two Pakistanis, and he was freed, and the crisis passed. I've been asked as I've been out hawking this book how on earth I had stumbled into this terrain, but the honest answer is that it's fairly obvious for someone like me. I mean, obviously the degree of coincidence here is unusual, but it's fairly obvious if you're looking at the fundamentals of a relationship to see what the basic tensions are. I mean, you didn't have to have the Raymond Davis case to know that the CIA, depending on but not trusting the ISI in Pakistan as it pursued Al-Qaeda, our greatest national adversary for the moment, would seek to have its own independent sources of information, and that it would run what we would call unilateral operations, sometimes with undeclared personnel, in an effort to get the very best information it could so as to evaluate the information it was getting through its normal liaison relationship with its Pakistani partner. In my mind, that's just in the nature of things, and that certainly was the case when I was thinking about the plot of the book several years ago. Similarly, as I think about this part of the world and think about how we're going to get out of the situation in which we've gotten ourselves so deeply, both in Pakistan and in Afghanistan, I do think there's great wisdom in the cultural rituals for resolving disputes that I've summarized with the term blood money. But if you read the book, or more to the point, if you know something about the Pashtun culture, the Pashtunwali, you'll know that this is a part of the world where people are very good at starting wars and get into them all the time, but partly as a consequence of that, they're also pretty good at ending them, or at least finding ways to balance equities between combatants. And I think that there's a very powerful lesson for us there. I've said this to American officials when I go to interview them, and I will say this to this audience. As we think about a process over the next several years that will lead to the withdrawal of our troops from Afghanistan and hopefully to a more stable relationship with Pakistan, I think it's important to understand that in the culture of that part of the world, you don't resolve a dispute without preserving, sometimes reinforcing the other party's sense of dignity. That balance of worth and value and dignity is part of what makes resolving a dispute possible. If one side is humiliated, we tend to think, in my judgment, that it will be easier to resolve the dispute because you've overwhelmed the other side. But in truth, the more we look at conflicts in this broad part of the world, the more we can see that just isn't so. That paradoxically, from our standpoint, the weaker people are in terms of all the physical attributes, the more determinedly they hold on to their dignity, the more they refuse to capitulate in the way that we want and expect. So I do think that as we think about a process of negotiation, extrication, which I think is essential for our country, that we ought to bear in mind the fundamental traditions and rituals of this culture, because if we don't bear them in mind, if we try to overwhelm them, sometimes when I read the news about about night raids and you know, how many mid-level Taliban we've taken out and how many predator attacks we've staged. You know, on the tactical level, you know, I think that that's a show of our strength, and there are many advantages. But I think on the strategic level of extricating ourselves, we do have to bear in mind that there's a cost. That the idea that you can pound your adversary into the ground and then he'll put up a white flag and say, "That's it. Sorry, Charlie. Never should have done it in the first place." It just doesn't happen that way. This book is a thriller, not a treatise in political science, but it does try to explore those issues in the lives of the characters. So let me just say a few words about how I came to write this book. I actually set out to write an entirely different novel. This, I hope, will give you some insight into what a strange business writing fiction is. It was 2008. The markets were crashing. All anybody was thinking about was money and how it was managed and mismanaged. And I got fascinated with the issue of how the CIA might, in the world that we're living in now, finance its operations, or how people who were operating outside of the cone of legality might do that. I had a friend who still runs one of the big hedge funds in London, and I said, "Can I come camp out at your hedge fund, kind of live in Mayfair, and look over your shoulder at how your operations work? Because I think I'd like to write a novel." I even had a title for it. I was going to call it Mayfair, which, as I said the other night, sounds like you know, Thackeray or George Eliot. You know, Mayfair. You know, lords and ladies going around St. James. But it was a book. I was so serious about it. I wrote a 15,000 word outline for my publisher. I mean, that's for some writers, that's, you know, almost to a novel at 15,000 words. So, you know, I had a lot invested in it. In 2009 decided to get some work done. I'd already spent my time researching at this hedge fund. And I thought, to really get writing, I would escape Washington and I would go back to Paris, where I used to live. And the apartment I used to have, which is just unspeakably wonderful, when I invited the former French Foreign Minister Dominique de Villepin to my apartment, which was literally next to the Eiffel Tower, he said, you know, "Mon cher ami, you know, that this is forbidden. C'est défendu. You know, you have privatized the Eiffel Tower. You've turned it into your lawn ornament." But it's a magnificent apartment. It has a balcony that wraps around the entire apartment. It's on the Quai Branly next to the Eiffel Tower. So anyway, it was taken over when I left by a prosperous friend of mine who knew that having some Paris real estate was a good idea. And so he let me camp out there, and I just hid away in September of 2009 for weeks. The Washington Post couldn't find me, and I worked on this novel. I was on my way to Pakistan, where I had been visiting with greater and greater frequency, and so I thought, well, I'll work on my hedge fund novel. And then I went off to Pakistan, and on this trip I ended up visiting Wana in South Waziristan. I went to Peshawar. I sort of bumped around the tribal areas with, inevitably, escorts from the inter-services intelligence. You just don't get to South Waziristan without a minder from the ISI. And I also had a chance to talk to their top officials. If I describe what their headquarters looks like in the Atbara neighborhood, it's because I've been there. And if I describe what the Director General's office looks like, sort of, I was taking some liberties. Again, it's because I've been there. And that's part of the fun of researching these books. Anyway, I got back from this trip, and I kept trying to get to work on this hedge fund novel. And I'm sure it won't surprise you that I really couldn't, and that something had just taken over not only my conscious interests as a journalist, but my preconscious, subconscious interests as a writer. And it just was crowding out the other. It was insisting on entering into the story that I'd written. So all of a sudden, new characters began appearing, and the shape of the book changed. A lot of the hedge fund stuff actually stayed in, but as a secondary plot, and it really became the book that I have been describing to you, and that I read to you the beginning of. So there's that accidental process at work. I think any novelist who's being honest would say that the work that you do is a combination of planning. It's important to be careful in planning a book, especially if it's wants to be a thriller, because you got to be sure that you kind of get around the corners of your plot. And every reader of this kind of book has come to expect a sort of triple backflip in the last 20 pages, and everything you thought was going on. Oh, geez, it's completely different. So, you gotta think a little bit about that and how you're gonna get to that point. But then there's another part, and this is the part that makes writing fiction for me a deeply pleasurable experience, and is the reason that I have done it now through 8 novels, is the sense of really being taken over by the preconscious side of creative work. I've said this in other settings, but I'll repeat it. I think we all know from anything that we do that's creative and spontaneous, whether it's playing tennis, one of my tennis buddies is in the audience, or playing golf, playing music, just a spontaneous conversation that produces laughter and pleasure. We know that the things that are powerful in that way, as we say, just fall into our heads. Malcolm Gladwell has written a book about this phenomenon that he called Blink, but it's just a fact that the things that are really powerful and creative are preconscious. They're not conscious. You can try, will yourself. I mean, why are writers famously such drunks? Through history, not now, of course. The answer is that they're trying to get to that. They're trying to will that conscious self away. I'm just convinced they want to get into that preconscious state. I gave a kind of lay sermon once at an Episcopal cathedral where my best friend from high school was the dean, and I talked. The title of this was "What Writers Know About Grace." And any of you who have thought about the Christian doctrine of grace, this idea, this state that descends inexplicably, undeservedly from places we don't understand, and then makes transformation possible. Well, that's writers are seeking that same sense of being written. Not writing, but being written, being taken over by the work that they're doing. So, that process happened to an unusual extent with this book, and I wanted to share it. And it ended up being very much a book about Pakistan and the U.S., even though it started off being a book about money, and set primarily in London. I'm going to say a few words about the kind of hard political science issue that we're supposed to talk about. And I should note that I'm looking forward to taking questions from the audience, and I'd be happy to address any aspect of really anything that's on your mind, to be honest. But let me talk about this relationship and where it's going, in my judgment, and what the lessons of my own research, both journalistic and for this novel, tell me. The first thing that I would say is that the United States and Pakistan need each other. We need Pakistan's help because we're fighting a war next door, but beneath that, the reason why we're fighting a war next door, we're trying to deal with a movement that really began with Pakistani sponsorship and American sponsorship, and then got out of control, and that's Al-Qaeda. We all know that history, but we do have to remember we pumped money and guns into that part of the world, into Afghanistan and the tribal areas, in what was an overwhelmingly successful effort to push the Soviet Union out. And then we walked away, and we left the Pakistanis holding the bag. And what we'd created, and with their help, scared the heck out of them. And so the ISI did what any intelligence service would do, which was to infiltrate, work with, try to contain, try to manipulate. In the end, was manipulated by these people on the borderlands who we had brought into being. So that story, in the way we all understand, ends up at the towers in New York, and our country responding. It's also a fact that jihadi movement has come to threaten Pakistan in ways that I think nobody understands better than ISI officers. That's one paradox that I want to note for people. Although we quite correctly get furious at the Pakistanis for playing what we think of as a double game. I say in this book, in talking about my imaginary character, General Malik, to say that he was playing a double game didn't do him justice. His game was much more complicated than that. But this movement that developed in the tribal areas that Pakistan really wanted to walk away from, wanted to kind of do just enough to get by in terms of its relationship with the United States, wanted to make a temporary deal to kind of get you through the next year, which was the story over and over again in the Swat Valley, in other tribal areas outside the settled areas. Those tactics of delay and compromise really have ended up hurting Pakistan. I was sitting in a briefing in ISI headquarters, and I will never forget when the briefer turned to me and shouted, "David Ignatius, don't you know how many people we've lost in this war?" And a slide went up on the PowerPoint with their killed and wounded, and it's in the many thousands. And anybody who's been to Pakistan or who reads the Pakistani press knows that. Thankfully, this has been diminished in recent months, but there was a period when there was a suicide bomb going off every other day, and often the targets specifically were ISI headquarters or personnel. I have a number of people that I know in the ISI who have been personally targeted, whose family members have been killed. So this is personal. So to return to the point I was making. We need them, they need us. That said, as encapsulated in the scene that I read in the beginning, we don't trust each other. And we have good reason not to trust each other, because we really each pursue unilateral, independent operations to protect ourselves. They're hedging their bets to protect themselves against us, the prospect that we'll walk away, all the bad things that we might do to them. And we're hedging our bets against them by running our own separate information gathering when we decide operations to capture or kill senior Al-Qaeda figures, and most notably in our Predator drone program, which is really arguably our only weapon in North Waziristan, but still is problematic for the Pakistanis. So. I've said in other sessions that if this was a marriage, you'd look at it and you'd say, these two just can't get along. They needed a divorce. I mean, they've tried counseling. If in his next life, I want Admiral Mullen to be a marriage counselor, because he has been patient. Constant, persistent, as have a number of other officials, but Admiral Mullen most notably. And yet the counseling, the patience keeps arriving, both sides at moments when they just get furious at each other. I'll never forget visiting last year special forces, nominally secret, at least until I got there, a facility where about 100 U.S. Special Forces are training members of the Pakistani Frontier Corps in counterinsurgency. One of the success stories in Pakistan, to my mind, is the growth and skill of the Frontier Corps in reestablishing a degree of order in the tribal areas. So I'm there seeing our trainers and seeing this great joint program that we're behind the scenes conducting. And the next day, the day after I was there, one of our helicopter gunships goes over the border and ends up killing, in the incident that I'm sure most of you remember, killing a number of members of the Frontier Corps. And the Pakistanis went nuts, and you may remember the scenes of fuel trucks being torched on the highway to the Khyber Pass, and what a mess it was, and that was a paradigm. So you look at that and you think, geez, they need a divorce. The more I've thought about it, it seems to me that a divorce, although it's attractive on one level, really is undesirable and impossible. It's not just for the sake of the kids, although you could look at it that way. But there's still a kernel of love here in this couple. I mean, and by that I mean there's a kernel of national interest that is so strong, that is so crucial to their future and our future, that you'd say to give that up would be nuts. I mean, it's just like you can't walk away from love. You can't walk away from your interests. They're too basic. So, I've ended up thinking that, stretching this analogy to the point of it's going to break, but what they need is a separation. They need a period in which they kind of, without a break, try to think about things, think about the basic equities, think about how to do it better, communicate long distance, send each other, letters that hopefully will ripen into something more useful. It's common in this administration to talk about that kind of thing. I'm using my romantic metaphor, but they of course choose a computer metaphor, and they call it a reset, which is a lot less romantic, but that's fine. We'll call it a reset, just as we had a reset with Putin's Russia. Maybe we can have a reset with Pakistan. One feature that made the reset with Russia possible, that I would note with reference to Pakistan, was that Putin, a very hard man to achieve a reset with, was replaced as president by Dmitry Medvedev, a man who had different values, who presented a different start, a different opportunity, and it is entirely possible that in the months, certainly the years ahead, that we'll see the Zardari government replaced by another government, and I think that will dramatize the reset. I would also note, and this is a final point, as much as I esteem the professionalism of many of the Pakistani military officers that I've met, I wouldn't say that universally, but I think this is the idea that this army is basically a proto-jihadist group that's about to, I just don't think that's true. They have many problems, but I think the Pakistani army retains a core of professionalism that we should note. I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Let's just go on. So I'm going to return to my basic point about reset. That I'm trying to remember what it was about this army. Oh, I know what it was. That the Pakistani military has just been through a series of incidents. The raid on Abbottabad is one, but even more dramatic, I think, is the raid and takeover of the naval base, the naval air base in Karachi, that was so deeply embarrassing to the Pakistani military that its position in society relative to civilian institutions is a little bit different. And the point that I wanted to make and forgot momentarily was, I mean, in the end, that's really the game that we want to be playing. We want to see in Pakistan, as in Egypt, as in Syria, as in every country you can think of that has an authoritarian, basically military-driven government. We want to see the growth of modern civilian institutions that can adapt to the modern world, to a global economy. And interestingly, I just note, and this is my final point before I turn to you for questions, this is a moment in which the balance in Pakistan between the military and the civilian side is a little bit different. The military is embarrassed. They're embarrassed that it was so easy for us to fly into Abbottabad and conduct that raid. They're embarrassed that clearly, with the connivance of some people in the Pakistani Navy, a very sophisticated extremist group was able not only to enter this compound, but to seize it and hold it for a number of hours. I mean, this was like the Mumbai attack, except it was even more professional, and it was inside Pakistani territory. And I think that scares Pakistanis, and it ought to scare them, and it ought to scare the military, and it ought to make everybody say, we have got to get more serious about this. Here's one more sign that this is a problem that we really need to deal with. And hopefully that call will be led by civilian politicians who will get their act together, whether it will be this government or some successor, I don't know. So I want to close my comments with that thought. Again, I think the idea of just sort of giving up on this relationship and saying, that's it, you know, we just have had it with these people, while it's attractive and while a number of commentaries, pundits have said that, I think in the end isn't wise. And if you think about the basics of what's going on, actually you can see some things that we can work with. So let me close there and turn to the audience for your questions.
I do not agree that we can accommodate the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are an ideological movement. They have to be destroyed. There's no accommodation. They have to be taken out. This is the first one.
I didn't mean to disagree. I agree with that.
Right.
I agree with that.
The second point I'd like to make is this, that Pakistan and the United States have been very, very close and dear friends. We have been CETO, CENTO, different organizations. But more than that, at this stage, when China is expanding at a furious pace, taking a distance from Pakistan at this stage would mean handing Pakistan as a gift to China. Thank you.
On your first point, I think that's right. And what I meant to say was, in thinking about the ISI officers who themselves have been victims of this terrorism, I can think of one very senior officer who said to me in those same words, "We cannot live with this. My children, I have not sent my children away. They're living in Pakistan. My children cannot grow up in the world that these monsters would create." And this is a man who's a decision maker, and so he knows it, but he has to act on that. On the question of China's role, I know that there's this feeling in Pakistan that the Chinese deliverance. A Pakistani friend of mine said to me recently, "Thank God, for once we're on the right side of history. We may be in trouble with you Americans, but our best friends, ever closer, are the rising superpower of the future, the Chinese." So he was basically saying, what do we care if our relationship with America goes to hell? We have the future on our side, and I think that's a mistake on many levels. But the most important is, I don't think China has any desire to get entangled in the kind of relationship that Pakistan envisages. And if you want, we just had a demonstration of that in their reluctance to take the naval facility that Pakistan was offering. So while it's true that we need to be careful in pulling away and letting the Chinese play a larger role, I think in the end, what's going to deter the Chinese from overplaying their Pakistan hand is India, Indian power, other Southeast Asian countries. I mean, one sense I have as somebody who travels the world quite widely is that there's growing uneasiness throughout Asia about Chinese power, how it's being exercised. So I think it's creating its own reaction. But I certainly take your point that the Pakistanis may be tempted to think there's this alternative, and the Americans may make that problem even worse. Thank you.
We can say that we want civilian institutions there, and obviously everybody wants civilian institutions there, but the history shows that the very same ISI, which we know at the core is working towards the right goals that we have, has zero accountability to the people themselves. When was the last time that a Pakistani military major officer was put on trial for any sort of crimes at all? How can we really make peace with that situation? And quickly, the second part of my question is, how do we account for the parts where our interests don't align? For instance, in Afghanistan, how you stated, the United States is trying to build a sustainable government there, and obviously Pakistan is our ally, but a sustainable government in Afghanistan means an Afghanistan that needs to build local ties, for instance, with India, something that Pakistan has been very, very against.
On paper, there is no difference today in the preferred outcome, how the preferred outcome in Afghanistan is described by all the major players, Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, and the United States. That was not the case until Prime Minister Singh's visit, and it's really important. I want to underline, because I don't think it's gotten enough attention. The only way out of Afghanistan for the United States that doesn't recreate the kind of mess that led to where we are now, in my judgment, is a resolution that involves some kind of regional security framework that has India and Pakistan both in the game. And for the first time, I think that everybody sees that and is prepared to say it publicly. That's why I think this was really an important visit. So I just note that. On your question about the public's feeling about the military, I mean, we really don't want to make Pakistan like Mubarak's Egypt. We keep sort of making demands. Officials will travel to Islamabad and they'll kind of read the riot act to General Kiani, and then quietly in public they'll kind of talk as partners, and then they'll do the same and do something for their public, and it's not a good situation for anybody. And all you have to do is think about the shame that Egyptians felt during the Mubarak years about their government and the way in which it seemed to be a child of the United States, and the shame, I'll just say it, I mean the shame that Pakistanis feel today when they think about a similar relationship that's developed with the United States. People don't like to feel that their country, and especially their military, is being pushed around by others. It embarrasses them, and we just need to be more sensitive to that. It's not unreasonable that the Pakistan, I think a lot of Pakistani public opinion, the anti-Americanism is just over the top, and they need to get away from it. But on this point, I think it's a fair point, and I think you were speaking to that. The Arab Spring is about people who felt a sense of shame about their government, saying we're not going to take it anymore. We want a government that's that's ours, and we're going to drive the process. We're not going to be victims. We're not going to be objects of history. We're going to be the subjects, as somebody said. So I think that's what we ought to want. It's just a question of how to get there.
You mentioned the ISI acquaintance of yours who does not want to live with the monster anymore. How far down the road could we go if we acknowledged that we, in collusion with the Pakistani military and ISI, are Dr. Frankenstein?
Wow. if we acknowledge that we're Dr. Frankenstein, that we created this monster, that's well said. I think that's part of, you just said in a way that I hadn't really conceptualized, what the balance of mutual respect and deference would look like and sound like if you were going to be serious about negotiations. There's something I mentioned in the book, a wonderful, in this Pashtun culture, if you want to settle a conflict, you sometimes abase yourself. You show that you humble yourself so that your adversary will accept you across his hearth and in a context where he has to be welcoming. And I've read that sometimes these Pashtun tribesmen would put grass in their mouth as if they were farm animals, as if they were beasts of the field, to humble themselves, to show that they wanted to sit down and talk. Well, for us to say, we created this, we started this, and you're living with it, is a way of humbling ourselves. American public would be, I'm sure, upset, but so what? I mean, it's the truth. So that's a very powerful idea.
In your judgment, if there is a really substantial withdrawal, what would be the consequences for us? What are we actually achieving and doing in Afghanistan now? We won't get a bloodbath, as you mentioned. There aren't any packs in Miami, so we don't have that problem. There may be in Dearborn, I don't know. But what are the other? There'll be a bloodbath, but they've always had tribal battles. So what?
If you basically signal we're out of there, mission accomplished, sayonara. You basically, as I say tomorrow, unless the Taliban is a charity organization in disguise, it's going to say, well, I don't think we're very interested in a negotiated settlement anymore. Why should we be? You're leaving. So we do have to be careful about that. And I underline that the desired outcome here is a regional framework that stabilizes Afghanistan somewhat. It's still going to be ragged. And for the first time, I actually can see how that would happen. I never could before. Richard Holbrooke used to talk about it all the time, but I never saw it, and I begin to see glimmers of it.
I have a question that on one side that CIA and ISI cooperating with each other, but on the other side that ISI is involved in disappearances of Sindhis and Baloch in Sindh and Balochistan province. It's evidence in Amnesty International and State Department. And the second part of my question is also, we can't forget the Daniel Pearl and Salim Shahzad and many other journalists, and even Benazir Bhutto's. I think the ISI's involvement in that things too. Maybe in future that I'm thinking that maybe possible that ISI become as a terrorist organization declared by State Department. What do you think about it?
We had the experience in the United States of intelligence organizations that had too much power domestically, and that were abusing that power in frightening ways. And that's really what Watergate and the aftermath of Watergate were about, was exposing those secret networks of power. And we've become very suspicious of them. And I think that's one of the great things about our country since Watergate. A lot of problems, but people take civil liberties, keeping intelligence organizations out of our lives, making sure that their power is subject to some oversight. That's a key thing for us. And Pakistan needs it. Pakistan needs to learn that in a modern country, intelligence organizations are subject to lawful oversight. They are not a law unto themselves. And when that happens in Pakistan, and the ISI is subject to review and control, proper review and control, as the U.S. case shows, Pakistan will be a better country for it. The truth is, every country needs to get its intelligence organizations under a rule of law, period.
Hi, my name is Saba Ahmed, and I'm the president for Defense of Human Rights, an organization based out of Pakistan that helps missing persons families. What I was wondering was, our organization currently has over 840 missing persons registered, out of which we were able to get about 340 released through the Pakistan Supreme Court. And most of these people are randomly picked up all over the country and held for unlimited times of period, and aren't brought under any court of law. And it's the ISI and it's the military who does this. And our chairperson, Amna Janjora, her husband's been missing for the last 5 years. and she's been struggling. She's knocked every parliamentary door, every Supreme Court door. We got evidence of people who were that he was in a military cell. My question is, the whole CIA policies in Pakistan. I mean, we must remember Osama bin Laden was a CIA operative in the 90s. He didn't just come up with all these plans by himself. I think our strategy is deeply misguided, and we are really hurting the mass public of Pakistan through these missing persons cases and such. I wanted to get your insights on this issue.
To the extent that we're propping up a military and an ISI that are too powerful and are not subject to a rule of law because we need them, we're doing something that's contrary to our long-term interests, and also in terms of the human rights issue that you raise, is very troubling. I thank you for saying that.
With so much ingrained distrust between the ISI and the U.S. agencies, do you think there's any hope of getting a good working relationship in the future, or does the ISI need a major restructuring in order for that to happen?
Pakistanis want to feel that their intelligence agency is not controlled by the U.S. The U.S. wants to feel that civilians, in the end, run Pakistan, and that the Army and ISI are subject to their control. I think one thing the killing of bin Laden does do, and I'll just make this as a closing comment, I think we have to be careful of saying bin Laden's dead, that's it, goodbye to Afghanistan. That we need to be careful about how we get out of Afghanistan. But the killing of bin Laden and the fact that Al-Qaeda really is on the run does mean that our policy toward Pakistan doesn't have to be a prisoner of sort of one. We don't have to just maximize one variable, which is our relationship with, need for, support for Pakistani military, ISI, and their CT policy. That, again, we do have a broader agenda, and we want to pursue it. Senator Kerry is one of my, I think he really has tried through the Kerry-Lugar Berman bill to keep our sights focused on a broader package of aid. That doesn't seem to be making us many friends in Pakistan, but we should keep doing it no matter what. I would love to see, as we properly reduce the number of troops in Afghanistan, to take that money and apply it to the experiments that really are going to, my three daughters' futures depend on whether we help Egypt get it right and build a real democracy, whether we help Pakistan get it right and build a real democracy, whether those countries have rule of law where people feel secure in their homes, in their businesses. They don't feel that somebody's going to rip them off and demand 5% of whatever they get. So, I'd love to see some of that 110 billion or whatever the heck it is, be applied to those programs that matter. So let me end it here. Thank you so much for coming and for sitting through this.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.